You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your Scottish martyr host, Abraham.
Oh, man. And I am your, I don't know, I guess you're riding the Mayflower away from oppression host, Shane.
Nice. We had those locked and loaded, you can tell.
Yeah, totally not off the cuff.
All right, so this week we are following up our previous week's discussion talking about freedom. We got really into this discussion with each other, went way off the road of the notes, the path that we had originally set, and instead it turned more into a discussion that was sort of off the cuff, and I think it was better for it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Great. But always introduce, if you're joining us for the first time, we're a psychology podcast. We talk all things psychology. We try to be comedy and science and entertainment and edutainment. And welcome to what we are doing here. This is a replacement for your Psych 101 class, by the way.
Yeah, it doesn't count for college credit, and you're certainly not paying as much money for it. But, you know, here we are.
Indeed. You can support us in various ways. You can join us on Patreon. You can leave us a rating and review. You can buy something from our merch store. You can tell a friend. We'll talk more about that at the end of this episode. And last week, as I said, we talked about, we'll just do a quick recap. We were talking about freedom. We essentially talked about the idea that freedom of whatever does not mean freedom from consequences. So freedom does not mean that it is unrestricted. We talked last week about things like artistic freedom, intellectual freedom, academic freedom, and then just defining freedom. And I think it'll be useful to just make sure we're clear on the outset here that freedom, as we defined it last time, is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint, as sort of the primary definition. But there were other definitions too.
We're also talking about freedom of government oppression and also the freedom of being in prison. So like there's a lot to unpack. And in the last episode, we did talk about different types of freedom as well. We talked about academic and artistic freedom and also intellectual freedom. And we would like to continue that discussion by defining some of the other types of freedoms that do exist out there in the world that are going to help inform this discussion.
And a little bit real quick, we also mentioned that freedom in the sort of behavior science sense refers to freedom from aversive control through certain contingencies such as punishment and that sort of thing. And also, of course, physical restraint is another one that would come up inside of that. And this idea, the saying that's often used of my freedom to swing my fists stops at your nose.
Yes.
I'm sort of free to do whatever as long as it's not directly impacting others or taking away their rights or their freedoms.
Absolutely. 100%.
All right. So let's jump in with some economic freedom.
So economic freedom is the type of freedom specifically referring to the ability of people to take economic actions in free markets. And this means that with access to economic funds, people have the right to access free markets and free trade without government restriction. This also includes the ability to freely produce and trade goods and services. So in a free market, you can actively buy and trade and sell and do all these things. And what you'll see is kind of like how the United States kind of has a system that is close to that. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it is close to that.
All right, so are you unsure what a free market looks like? Well, let's take a look at some indices of economic freedom. So according to various indices, common themes that indicate economic freedom include, but are not limited to, the ability to hold property, regulation of labor, size of government, ability to participate in the market, and freedom to operate a business.
So based on these indices that we just talked about, the United States, Canada, Australia, and most of Europe are considered economically free. So thanks, colonizers, for that one, I guess.
Good job.
So those countries, you'll see, like they operate as like a somewhat free market overall.
This discussion, I think, could go on for a very long time, but I think just for the sort of food for thought consideration here that I've been throwing in is what with this economic freedom, running a business, owning a business, what does that mean for people who, let's just say they take over and exploit land, siphon off the resources and sell them as products, and in doing so create this nightmare of a pollution problem and destroy that land for potential future use, often displacing other people in their homes. And they make a lot of money doing this, are very successful financially. Is that a freedom that's guaranteed to them? What about the freedom to manipulate people to buy products that they don't need or even want sometimes so that you make money? Right now, this is how the business operates in the United States. That if you can own a piece of land, you're essentially free to do with that land what you like, no matter how it affects people in future generations.
Right.
And that's how a lot of these businesses work. So, like, should there be this freedom to exploit resources if you can be, basically it's a race. Who's the first one who gets there, right? The first one who thinks of it gets a guaranteed spot at the top of the food chain, economically speaking. And so what does that mean for us?
Yeah, I mean, you just described the premise of the Lorax perfectly.
Exactly.
I mean, it's really truly what it is. Like, nobody needs the need, despite how much he sings about it. So,
yeah.
But you're right. I mean, this is a lot of times economic freedom might come on the backs of not having any sort of restrictions in place to begin with to protect people in these spaces. I mean, I think that we've gotten better with laws and rules on like how to enter into spaces and do that. But I mean, there was a whole time where, I mean, literally the entire Wild West, like that was just people just going out, claiming land and doing whatever they wanted with it with no regard to consequence to the people or the impact that it would have. So there is like kind of this like problematic layer to this that is really interesting. And I think part of it too is I feel like economic freedom has to exist in a space where consent is provided. And so people have gotten around this idea of consent to certain things. Like, I mean, there's ads on your phones and stuff on specific social media because you have agreed to terms and policies and essentially consented to whatever they use, whatever data sharing, whatever data mining is used by those platforms in those terms and agreements. So there's some really interesting stuff when you kind of get into economic freedom and what it really means.
Yeah. And actually, the last administration worked really hard to roll back the freedoms and rights that were protected for people and give them instead to organizations that wanted to take their land and use them to dump chemicals in their water and pull things out of the ground that they wanted to use, to run pipes through their areas that were full of harmful chemicals and would destroy the natural landscape and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like this is a fight that goes on in the United States a lot, is this sort of like, business is best, and so whatever is good for the dollar is good for the country, and so therefore they've put, as you said, it's gotten a lot better. There's a lot of restrictions saying that we can't just wantonly destroy everything, but there is still a lot of access to do that. Should that be considered a protected freedom? Like, again, they're swinging their economic fist around and punching everyone in the face from now to future generations forever. And so like it does seem like this violates even the basic idea of freedom.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
It's interesting because it doesn't feel like it's a complex conversation around that, but it becomes one when you start looking at like, okay, where's the line? And that's the problem with any of these freedoms, is like you have to kind of figure out where that line is. And there's always kind of a moving goalpost when it comes to these lines, depending on which administrations are in place, depending on people's interests and stuff like that. It becomes kind of this unique discussion that is continuing. I mean, continuing to this day and will likely continue for as long as humans have language.
I want to throw in one more quick example.
Please do.
And I think I talked about this on the show before, but there was this business, I think in Oregon, I want to say, where the owner and CEO decided what he was going to do is pay everybody equally, including himself. And he basically took a gigantic pay cut to increase the salary of everybody that worked there. So this is a private company. The owner decided that he just wanted to pay his employees really well. And he went down to the minimum salary and gave everybody else gigantic raises. And everybody then was making enough to buy homes, to like be financially independent and that sort of thing. And what's interesting about it, again, this is his choice. This is his company. He could do whatever he wanted with it, and he chose to do that with it. He was just torn apart by people on the right, thinking he was destroying capitalism, which again tells me that like you're not actually interested in the freedom of companies to make these decisions. You're not interested in giving them the independence to make choices with their money. All you're interested in, like this is really showing the cards here. What your values are is that they stepped on a little guy to do it.
Yeah.
If they're not stepping all over somebody, then you're like, I am not in support of this.
Right.
They need to be crushing people under their heels in order for them to like feel good about their capitalist venture. And so the fact that someone used capitalism to do some good was like extremely offensive to some of those people who was criticizing him.
100%.
And like that to me is like wild. And I think really shows where again, this isn't a freedom issue.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it.
And just to update on that company too, they're doing really well.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
They have proven that actually works. So, I always love when that stuff happens. He's like, it's going to be an experiment. We'll see what happens. And it's like, they've been thriving. So,
yep. Been doing great.
So I think that we should take some time to talk about freedom of religion, especially coming off the back of our atheism episodes, right?
Fact.
Freedom of religion. The whole reason the U.S. got started with a group of people who wanted to be so free from religious persecution that they created an even more restrictive government full of lots of religion. So for reference, just to kind of give everybody a heads up on that, you might be offended by that. The U.S. does not have an official religion, despite the vast majority of people believing it to be a Christian nation. Psst. Heads up. It's not. It's not a Christian nation. It's that there is no official religion, just so y'all know.
Yeah. Just a lot of support for Christianity here.
100%.
Religious freedom refers to the ability of an individual or community to practice their preferred religion in public or private without oppression. I do think that on this part, the United States has actually done better than many other countries have done.
Yeah.
And it could continue to be much better, of course, than it currently is. Check out our recent episodes on atheism we've talked about, might be of interest of people who are talking about this. But again, just asking the question, what does this mean when we look at the other side of this? And specifically, does this include the freedom to force religious ideology on children?
Right.
Because that's what's happening.
Right.
If they do not get a choice in this, and they will not get a choice until they're 18. And at that point, they've already been through 18 years of being force-fed that as a narrative. So is that really a choice at that point? What about people with intellectual disabilities? Similar. Someone comes by telling them like, did you know that you're going to die and go to hell? And they're like, what?
Yeah.
These are vulnerable populations that can be easily persuaded by misinformation. And do people have a right to impose their information on things? Now, I'm going after religion here, but this could be the opposite of this too. Is like, let's say you took someone who is like, not atheism per se, but like some militant perspective on something, I'm going to be silly for a moment if I can. The Berenstain Bear books being like the greatest literature of all time. And it's like, there will be no books other than Berenstain Bears.
Sure.
That's right. We will read nothing besides Berenstain Bears. You will not even know that other books exist.
Unless you're in the parallel universe where it's Berenstain Bears. So going back to our Mandela Effect episode.
Yeah. Actually, that came up on Peacemaker too.
Yeah, so scary.
Anyway, whatever it is. And like, should that family have a right to sort of teach that sort of thing? Like the kid doesn't have a choice. They're not learning about other things that are available out there. So just something to consider there.
To your point, I think that for the most part, the U.S. has done a pretty decent job of allowing people to express without being politically maligned or like they haven't been arrested for practicing certain things. But I mean, there are certain situations and circumstances and contextual things that have happened that have produced some pretty intolerant policies. I mean, the Patriot Acts were one of the worst things that the United States has ever done, and that was in the wake of 9/11. And we should probably maybe one day do an episode on like the coercion and the problems with the Patriot Acts in particular, because I think that was one where it targeted a particular group and absolutely put in more of an oppressive hold on a religious practice, even though they were saying, oh, it's not religion. It's not a religious thing. It's like, this group of people. And it became kind of a real problem for a lot of Muslim folks.
There was just recently in this country a few years ago, a ban on people coming to the United States if they were coming from countries that practiced the Muslim religion as one of their primary religions. Like that was a thing. Like if that's not religious persecution, I honestly don't know what is, right?
Seriously.
Yeah, there's a lot of that happens still. So yeah, it could be much better.
Yeah.
And also many people who will throw other religions under the bus commonly for having space lasers and whatnot. So.
God, she's so frustrating. So I think the last little bit of freedom, because we've been talking about these different freedoms, the last one we do want to talk about is political freedom. I think this is one that's really fascinating and one that we definitely have to make sure that we cover because it is so unique to the other ones. Now, political freedom is considered an essential feature of democratic nations, and this allows citizens to freely express their political viewpoints without oppression or coercion. Despite its many faults, this is one of the U.S.'s greatest strengths, though it would be even better if people received a better education to understand and express their political beliefs instead of pretending like it was a sporting event and selecting teams because they like the colors. We do have the freedom to do that, and that's why people like Vermin Supreme get to run for like city councils and stuff. If you're not familiar with him, he was the guy that wore the boot on his head when he would run and try to get elected.
I did not. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, everybody should look at Vermin Supreme. He's wild.
In democratic nations, there are often laws that protect these freedoms and allow citizens to continuously engage in political discourse. To a point, there are certainly a lot of laws in this country that have gone out of their way to undermine that, but I'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah. Some examples of this, though, in other countries that are not U.S.-centric. Nelson Mandela was famously imprisoned from 1963 to 1990 due to his or was he? Depending on the Mandela effect.
Right.
But he was released in 1990 due to his activism against apartheid in South Africa. And that's like there's a lot to unpack within that too. But he helped organize protests and attacks against government targets that were actively outspoken against these policies in South Africa at the time.
And there are other political prisoners, of course. There are people who were imprisoned for speaking out against their government, oftentimes doing simple protests and peaceful protests like refusing to eat or standing. Or sitting, like various things like that. And this included Mahatma Gandhi, Bertrand Russell is a recent one, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Lujan Al-Hawthul. Sorry if I'm ruining those, among many, many other people.
Yeah, there are political prisoners all around the world and have been occurring throughout history just for voicing their opinion against. I mean, North Korea has this particular issue right now. Anybody who speaks out against this is very much so going to be a political prisoner. Now, we have to ask the question, what does this mean for creating unequal voting access, disenfranchising voters, voter restrictions, voter fraud, and manipulating voter maps to create party or candidate-specific success regions? We talk about gerrymandering and stuff like that and how that becomes a significant problem. So I think there's a lot to unpack within that. I mean, is it really... It's free to a point where people are gaming the system, to win. I mean, essentially, it's like they're just gaming. Like gerrymandering is simply just gaming a system.
Yeah. There's something like of the last 5 or 6 presidents, 2 of them, at least, were elected while losing the majority vote. And that was because of how the maps are drawn and because of voter suppression and all kinds of shady stuff that happens behind the scenes. Right. And so if you were to go to a city and say like, well, we're going to reduce the voting machines per capita by like 75%. So it's really hard to get access to voting. Then I think people would understandably be up in arms about that. But that's exactly what has happened in this country in many states. Is things like we're going to make it as inconvenient as humanly possible. And we're going to make it as hard as possible, mostly in these areas where our political rivals are likely to have a lot of voting power. Right. And so like that right now is apparently a freedom that they have to do that, of like to make it so that votes don't count and that the populace doesn't matter and that only the far most extreme places are the ones with the loudest voice. And that is wild to me. Yeah. It undermines political freedom like you wouldn't believe. I mean, it truly does. It removes the voice of the people. It disenfranchises people from even attempting to participate in politics. And it just makes everybody, if you've ever had the thought of like, or the feeling of like, my vote doesn't matter, it's because of stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. Then this is basically, this is the linchpin of political freedom, I think. So. Yeah. Important note, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but also issue here of freedom from consequences is not what is something guaranteed by freedom, and the freedom of speech, which we've touched on a little bit. But I also think that it is an important part in here when they're talking about political freedom is freedom of the press. And how many times when you start going after a press for criticizing you, you're showing your authoritarianism. Like your tyranny is showing at that point. Yeah. Because like the press is almost obligated to criticize political leaders. Right. Like at the very least to report on in that way. And when you look at governments like Russia's a good example, like there's a huge disinformation campaign where they will not allow political rivals to have any screen or airtime whatsoever. They control all the news and messaging, and journalists who speak out against them are routinely disappear or are murdered. Right. And like that is not a country where there's freedom of information or freedom of press or political freedom. And so freedom of press is like just critically necessary for a democratic, free nation to exist. Because if you cannot speak out against your government, you do not live in a free government. Right. 100%. I could not have said that better myself. Yeah. And so as much as I would argue with some of these news outlets who are constantly pushing nonsense, and I think in a way are violating many people's freedom by pushing the amount of harm and disinformation that they've pushed for being simply critical, I would fight for the right to continue to criticize a president that I support as long as they're simply being critical. Right. As soon as it turns into advocating for harm, then I would no longer be in support of that. But 100%. The press has to be able to criticize this government, just has to. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, real quick, if I did not like you, listeners, this is just me personally. When I listen to podcasts and an ad just like happens out of nowhere, no warning whatsoever, I find that very irritating and rude. And if I didn't like you, listeners, then I would just not segue at all. It'd just be we're talking, all of a sudden ad happens, and then we're back to talking as if nothing happened. But I like you guys. And so I'm going to warn you right now that we're going to make this transition to an ad because I like you. And if I didn't like you, I wouldn't say that. And then we're going to come back after this. All right, we are back. We need to, I think, talk about when there is, or if there is, such a thing as too much of this freedom thing. Yeah, I feel like this is an important discussion because this does come up a lot when we talk about freedom. There is always kind of the question of like, how much freedom is too much freedom? When does it become a bad thing? And there are a lot of folks that make an argument about a world where too much freedom is actually a bad thing. And we think it's worth exploring those arguments for just a moment and evaluate what those people are saying because we like that sort of thing. We like to unpack different discussions around this. So the first one is going to be from a company called strategy/business or strategy-business. I guess it would be .com. Yeah. Yep. Strategy-business.com. They wrote a recent periodical about how there is such a thing as too much freedom. And in their argument, they go on to discuss a few concepts that are really relevant to this discussion we're having today. The first one is that psychological reactance refers to the psychological response related to being told what to do. That's sort of the idea there. Mm-hmm. Whenever choices are limited, or you're placed in a position where your freedom or autonomy are threatened, then you're more likely to respond defensively. And this actually is kind of related to a Skinner quote I used last time, which I'll bring back later.
You know, you've probably, as you heard that definition and you heard that example, you probably think about times where you just don't like being told what to do.
Yeah.
And so there's plenty of opportunities for that.
Yeah.
The other thing they mention here is the paradox of choice, which we talked about in our episode on choice and what that looked like. This refers to challenges that come up when there are too many options or choices, kind of like when you log into Netflix and there are so many choices, you don't know what to pick. Or maybe you've selected a better streaming service now that Netflix is starting to tank.
Wow. This episode sponsored by Netflix.
How far they followed.
All right. Now, the primary argument made in this article is in reference to a holiday policy an organization has set up that failed. So the original policy, you can take as much or as little time off as you like, no restrictions. Okay. The organization found that the policy was used more often by people with children and families who took up to 35 days in a year, whereas others took closer to 25 days. So what's the problem here? It was causing anxiety among team members, so they took the policy down entirely with the argument that there just wasn't sufficient clarity to feel like people were using the system the way that it was intended. And even though they basically said no restrictions, it felt like it was unequal to the people who were participating in that system.
My gut reaction when I was reading this was like, well, of course, it's a business website that's talking about why taking too much time off is not good for business. But that's not really what they were saying. It's like they weren't saying that the time off was a problem. It was saying that the anxiety was actually having an impact on their employees. And that was a thing that became kind of the failure within this. So what they did was they took out the policy and they reinstituted it with some boundaries in place, and that seemed to work a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this other article that was on euroculture.eu. It's got some European representation here. Mm-hmm. And the article was titled Lost in Freedom, The Dilemma of Having Too Much Freedom. I want to make sure I included the question mark there.
For sure. You nailed it.
Thank you.
So this article discusses the issue of being, quote, lost in freedom. With advancements in opportunities and access to too much information, many people have a wide array of interests and are highly educated, but feel, quote, stuck because of too many choices, kind of going into that strategy business article before. The author of this article goes on to say that they don't have a solution, which seems just, super helpful.
Yeah, great. We have a problem. End of story.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So, but they didn't really make a great argument. It was just kind of like the general hand waviness of going, we have too many choices. We're too intelligent compared to, so people are stuck. And it's like they didn't really have anything to make an argument for those things. So it was kind of if I'm being honest, it was kind of a waste of a time article. And I don't like it.
I almost wonder, and I'm not sure if you got the impression from this, but it almost sounds tongue in cheek to me. Like it was maybe originally said to be like, we're too smart with too many choices. What a problem we have. Like it was like that sort of thing. I don't know, but I feel like if you're going to leave it that way, that if you're not making a point, then that is making the point, which is that it's ridiculous to say this and we should have all the freedom we could possibly have.
Yeah, absolutely.
On slate.com, there's an article titled, Is There Such a Thing as Too Much Freedom? See, I got that question mark in there. I'm good at this. You're getting so good at it. Thanks.
So this article was in reference to the Trump election, and the argument is that there is a sudden rise in fears around illiberalism, which seeks to strip freedoms, supposedly. And Patrick Deneen is referenced in the article and argues that liberalism itself has allowed too much freedom and is partially to blame for breakdowns in, quote, family, community, religious norms, and institutions, especially among those benefiting least from liberalism's advance, end quote. So I don't know about you, but I think there's a pretty clear agenda from that dude.
Yeah. It's interesting because it does seem like from that camp, we see two opposite arguments made simultaneously, back to back, and sometimes embedded with one another. One is that we have too much freedom and we should have less. And the other one is that we don't have enough freedom and we should have more, whatever that might mean, because they're never defined or even examples given to allow a description to understand what that could possibly mean. Aside from usually the way that they tend to describe it is, we want to be free to make hate speech and violent threats against people that disagree with us. We want to be free to oppress and restrict people who dissent from our opinions. We want to be free to give unrestricted access to people who have the most amount of wealth and power. We want to be free to allow people to cause harm when and wherever they want, including inciting violence against minority groups. That seems to be the kind of freedom that they're advocating for, which to me is, again, not freedom. It doesn't meet the definition of freedom in any way that we've described, because freedom that involves everybody means that you can't have freedom if that system results in the oppression of another group.
Right. Yeah. Freedom does not exist where harm is occurring.
Right. So ultimately, the argument falls flat because the concern the interview showcases is one of destruction of moral fabric and not an actual problem. It's a hypothesized scare tactic to say, believe me, because whatever, because what I say is true. And right now, the argument I'm making is that there is too much freedom and that needs to be restricted. Hence, we need a tyrannical government so that they can give us more freedom because we need as much as we can. Hence, the tyrannical government, which I don't know how anybody makes sense of that on a daily basis, but that's where they're at.
Yeah, that's an argument that you see come up. It's really interesting. Now, the New York Times also had an article called "How Much Freedom is Too Much?" ?
Yes, you did it. That was
yay!
So good.
I'm learning. You modeled it.
We are in the business of promoting question marks in our oral recitations. Quick note. This article we're referencing was from 2003. So for context, we got 9/11 as a pretty recent event at the time that the article was written. The Patriot Act, which severely limited freedom related to personal information, due process, etc., in the United States. So essentially, the freedom to privacy kind of got thrown in the garbage with that one.
Yeah.
And so that's the context in which this article took place.
Well, and also, too, for those of you who are not aware, people could be arrested and detained without any sort of reason during this time period, like just because you were a suspect, and they could hold you for an indefinite amount of time without due process.
Which specifically violates our Constitution, but it's also why Guantanamo Bay exists, which also specifically violates our Constitution. So
yeah, and still exists, which is a real problem. So, that's a bipartisan issue. That's happened across every administration since 2001.
True, but not a bipartisan issue in terms of support, though, because, again, freedom actually doesn't matter in this particular, like the Constitution, they only want to defend it up until the point where it is in agreement with the things they believe. Because as soon as they're like, well, it's not constitutional to hold people without charging them indefinitely as political prisoners on like questionable soil that we appropriated, they're like, it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, we'll turn an eye. Now, the author of this article interviews Stephen Brill, who had recently written a book about the aftermath of 9/11, and he goes on to support risk profiling, national identification cards, and other more restrictive practices that allow government to determine who is, quote, trustworthy, end quote. And that was a big part of the arguments within this book, where that after 9/11, he was in favor of these restrictions, these reductions in freedoms, such as being able to freely move between states and being able to communicate, and also an increase in, like we talked about, racial profiling, risk profiling. If somebody was deemed like that fit a profile of, quote unquote said terrorists, they could be detained without due process and without that issue. Now, in the article, they even make note that prior to 9/11, Brill would have considered policies like the Patriot Acts very much so like the Iron Curtain. But as he puts it, quote, the terms of the debate have changed. It is not as though people had new arguments. It is as though someone had taken an eyedropper and changed the color of the background, end quote. So basically, he's taking a contextual approach to describe why freedom should be removed for certain people, despite the fact that there was no evidence to support that those restrictions were even helpful.
Very well said. Amazing soliloquy that I'm impressed with. And the main argument we've seen against this sort of like unrestricted freedom, or just a freedom that might amount to what you might call too much, is when it leads to harm and harm of others and that sort of thing. And I think that's a fair argument. When you have too many freedoms, potentially what happens is it leads to detriment of other people. And the question becomes, what is harmful? And that presents a unique situation that could become a slippery slope. I could see that, where you see people sort of slide away from freedom in such a way that they justify restricting freedoms for people. They also could like slide toward a situation, and again, we've talked about, where it's not really freedom anymore because you essentially have policies that undermine other groups. And so I think there's an important consideration there. And we need to hear from our sponsor, which is Netflix. The sinking ship is going to talk to you. We'll be right back. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the behavioral science view, the behavior science view of freedom, its definitions. And this, I think, is a lot of fun because, again, we start looking at it not just from this sort of political rhetoric laden position, but like, what do we mean scientifically, objectively, when we even use the word freedom, when we evoke that word.
Yeah. Within behavioral work, freedom comes up in a variety of ways, and it's worth noting that this doesn't necessarily align with what we've been talking about. So specifically, what we're going to talk about in this section is different discussions around human rights. So the first point is the freedom of choice usually refers to the ability to make choices within a treatment context. That is one part, freedom of choice that leads to different reinforcers or different rewards, different treatment outcomes. And essentially what we're saying here is that from a scientific or a behavioral viewpoint, the person who is receiving treatment should have a choice to continue treatment if they prefer, discontinue treatment if they deem fit, access preferred rewards, and have input about the goals and interventions used in treatment. Now, the big thing here, and the thing that I would really emphasize here, is that choice is, in freedom of choice, it largely involves consent, and really having a large discussion around consent and informed consent and what that means. Freedom of choice should be that the person is freely able to make a choice that is A, free from some kind of aversive control, somebody coercing them into a situation, and B, they have enough information to make the most accurate decision for them in that space.
So freedom from harm or abuse is another aspect of freedom that is discussed in several clinical settings. We're talking about psychology often, especially when working with people in vulnerable populations, such as those with an intellectual or developmental disability, geriatric populations, children, etc., that sort of thing. And so this aspect of freedom refers to the absence of something oppressive or abusive rather than a right to do something. Mm-hmm. So it's a freedom from coercive, aversive practice and not necessarily a freedom to have certain unimpeachable rights.
Yeah, and I think this is really important too, because as we talk about freedoms, one thing that we have talked about time and time again is that freedoms only extend so far as they're not harmful to others. And so as a basic human right, if we have the basic human right to be free from certain circumstances or certain harmful situations or contexts, then it is worth talking about within that too. Like that should be true for any sort of treatment. You should not be coerced into anything that is any sort of therapy or you really shouldn't have to be coerced into anything, but sometimes that happens. Now, the last point that we would make underneath this too, and we're going to talk in depth about this one, is that people have a freedom to do, but not freedom from consequences. And we touched on that briefly, but it's definitely worth talking about more. One of the more confusing aspects of freedom, specifically freedom of speech, is what it actually means, right? So people confuse freedom of speech with being able to be freely able to say whatever they want to say, but that's just not quite the case. And what ends up happening is this issue of cancel culture that comes along with it. And a lot of times there's often outrage about what the consequences are that come along with saying what you want. Again, you mentioned I'm allowed to say what I want, it's infringing on my rights. And it's like, that's not quite what is going on here. These two things are different discussions, and we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit.
In relation to this, there's often an example, I think, of citing in the United States, it may have at one point been illegal to burn an American flag, but that was actually held up by the Supreme Court as a free speech issue because burning an American flag was considered a symbolic language gesture, a speech gesture that was not directly causing harm to anybody and therefore was not something that the government would oppress. Now, if you burned a flag in an open field that led to a giant forest fire, then that would, because that would ultimately cost a lot of money for the government to put it out. It would put people in danger and that sort of thing. But simply burning a flag as a piece of demonstration is considered a free speech issue. Throwing a flag on the ground and driving over it in the mud if you wanted to could be considered a free speech issue. And so that would be something that has so far been upheld by our government, although is something that they have also, some people recently have talked about making that illegal again. They've also talked about making it illegal to do something like choose to kneel in the presence of the flag, that maybe there should be some restrictions in place that force you to lose your job if you choose to exercise that freedom of speech.
Right.
And so I think, there are people out there who basically want to say that equate those things, right, as being the freedom to do anything, and free speech means not freedom of consequences. I feel like that maybe I got a little confused.
No,
I hope I didn't make that sound confusing.
No, I think that makes sense, because I think a lot of times what happens is people, I don't want to just overgeneralize, but a lot of times when arguments of free speech come up, it usually surrounds something that's pretty emotionally or politically charged, and it ends up being just a values-based argument and not necessarily a rights-based argument. You may not agree with kneeling during the national anthem or anything like that. And that's perfectly fine if you don't agree with that. However, for you to impose your disagreement onto somebody else, that's where it becomes a free speech issue ultimately, right? Like that's where those discussions really start getting muddled, because it goes from I don't like what they're doing to I'm going to stop them from being able to have the freedom to do that. And that's where that rights issue really comes into play.
Yeah, and so there's often this outrage about consequences that come along with trying to say whatever you want, but those are two different things, right? They're different discussions, because as we've already said when we talked about free speech, there's like libel and slander laws. If you say something that results in harm to somebody, that's not protected speech. Mm-hmm. Public figures are often considered exempt from the same kinds of access to freedom of speech, because they're in positions of power that have a lot higher stakes with the things that they say and do. And so their speech is not necessarily considered private, and it is not necessarily considered to have the same level of freedom tied to it. And so that's something that can happen as well. And again, sort of US centric here talking about this, but the overall freedom from consequences is just not a thing. And again, I want to actually bring this back to talking about the behavior science perspective and what the restriction and aversive control means. Let me give you one very basic sort of hyperbolic example, right? Which is I have the freedom to put my hand on a hot stove. Mm-hmm. That is going to result in my hand getting burned, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that essentially is a restriction on my behavior, because I am now probably very unlikely to avoid hot stoves because I've experienced some aversive experience, or I'm putting my hand on a hot stove. So freedom is not ubiquitous. Like I do not have the power to violate the limits of my biology and to violate the laws of physics, because those are things that cannot be broken. Like, right. They simply are what they are. Like you could very much argue that I do not have the freedom to travel as I wish because I cannot fly through the air. I cannot swim under the ocean at high speeds, holding my breath for hours at a time. Those are ways in which my freedom is restricted because of the biological constraints of the evolutionary history of my species. Mm-hmm. And so like in those ways, I have basic restrictions. I can only move so fast. If I moved at a speed high enough, like I would eventually be hitting the air such that it would destroy my body. Mm-hmm. So like I can't be Flash or Quicksilver.
Not yet.
Not until I get a cool suit. And then
you need the Speed Force, baby.
That's right. And so, yeah, those are things like you could argue those are restrictions. And so there's like this basic thing that like freedom is just not anything goes. And those are some kind of silly ones, but I think to highlight the point that like you got to think about what those all mean. And then it becomes similar when talking about freedom, where if you do something, anything at all, it's going to have an impact on the environment, just like the hot stove. So, politically speaking, or free speech issue, when you do or say something, there's going to be some kind of a consequence. It might be one that you like. It might be very favorable, right? Mm-hmm. That could be an outcome of that, but it might be something extremely unpleasant. And so then there's these aversive consequences built in there too. So just, I think, important thing to bring back around is this idea of like, what do we mean when we talk about freedom and these aversive control and aversive consequences? Because there is no freedom from aversive control and aversive consequences.
There's this really great article on consent that came out pretty recently. And the research group that talked about it does a really good job of kind of describing what consent actually is. And if there are ever any aversives in place, then you're not actually providing consent. And I think there's like this idea of like the freedom to make a choice has to exist when there is no aversive control in place.
Yeah.
Right. Like your yes can change to a no very rapidly because of the averse consequences that are present or not present, or the threats of which those things do exist.
Yeah.
That's probably an entirely different discussion when we get into consent. I think that's definitely worth doing a whole episode on consent and really talking about what it is, consent and assent and all that.
I dig that.
But I do think, here there are, in the United States, you can kind of say whatever you want, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get away with it.
Yeah.
If I were a famous actor, for those of you who've never seen me in person, I am as like white as I could be, right? I could not be whiter. As a matter of fact, I got like my DNA test and it is like straight up all the whitest countries. It is like 99% like, actually it's 100% like England, Ireland, Denmark. Like, it's like, you're like, okay, I could not be whiter.
Yeah. They're like, you are basically a sour cream marshmallow.
Yeah. Like if I were a shade lighter, I would be clear. So I could, in the United States, I could say the N-word if I wanted to, right? I could absolutely do that. But that does not mean that I'm going to be free from all the consequences that go along with that. And I think that's really kind of the thing. There are aversive controls in place that would prevent me from saying that.
Yeah.
Besides the fact that I just don't want to say that because it's a horrible thing to say.
Yeah.
But there are aversive controls, right? Like if I'm somebody who would use the N-word as a white man in the United States, then I'm likely to lose my job. I'm likely to damage social relationships. I'm likely to damage my reputation. There's all these other aversive controls that would prevent me from saying that. So I don't say it. But there are some people that don't believe those aversive controls should exist and I should be able to say whatever I want. And that's simply not. They missed that second part of it, which is like, you can say what you want, but something's going to happen when you do it.
Yeah. Now, I also heard there was someone once who tried to make the argument. They were like, you shouldn't be allowed to swear because that violates my right to not have to listen to swearing. And I'm like, by that logic, I should say you have to swear because you not swearing violates my right to listen to swearing.
Right.
That to me is an utter nonsense argument. I'm like, now, if the swearing, as you said, was hate speech, like racial slurs and that sort of thing, that I think is a different class. But just generic swearing that is not tied to a particular group of people, like the F-bomb, or I'm just going to have Justin bleep a bunch of these just for fun, ass, bitch. Like all of those are words that they don't target anybody directly. Now, I think that some of them are becoming increasingly problematic from a perspective of like gender equality, for example, might be one that you choose not to use. Or several that you choose not to use because it's a messed up thing to target someone's gender identity in that way.
Right.
Or their sexual orientation. Like there are several that are in there as well. But most of them are the generic ones that don't have anything laden with a particular group or person. Like, I think you have the right to say those things because they're not spreading hate. They're just like a form of speech that I think would be considered protective. And like, if you don't want to hear that, then go elsewhere.
Right.
And that's actually not very fair. I could argue against that, but specifically like don't turn on things. Like here's an example. I have a huge problem with censorship in music. I mean, like I'm aggressively strong in my opinion about how much I dislike censorship in music. And so like my thought is like, if there's lyrics you're opposed to, don't listen to that song.
That's fine.
Don't play that song. Like that is you going to a place where you're going to hear offensive language and then getting mad that you heard it there. I'm like, now it's one thing if it's just being blasted at you, you don't have a choice. That I think would not be okay. I can be on board with the fact that like someone's just sort of forcing you to hear things you don't want to hear and that you should have the right to not be in that environment and not have it forced upon you. But to go to a place that you did not have to go, that was not on your way to where you were going, to choose to engage with something where you then were offended by it, that was not something where like it was thrown at you against your will. You went there, right? And so I think with censorship in music, I get very irritated by that because I'm like, if they wanted to have that language in their song, they made that choice for themselves. And like maybe them or their producers are like, well, I'm okay with having a censored version because then I sell more copies. And like, I get that that's fine too. But like, I think that just shouldn't have to exist. I think it's really dumb.
Yeah.
An example I've said it recently is that song called, I think, F You.
By CeeLo Green?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
And they just change it to Forget You. And that's like all over where you hear it played. I'm like, are there not enough songs for you to choose from? If they wanted it to be Forget You, they would have written Forget You. Just pick a different song.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, that's not what the song is. And it's offensively annoying to me that you sought out a song to change it to be this. Anyway, that's my rant on that.
It's putting shorts on Michelangelo's David. That's what you're doing.
Exactly right. Yeah. All those statues of women, like, you know, cover them up, and those penises, cover them up. We can't have that depiction of human beings. Human beings are bad.
It's funny though, when you think about, and this is just something I think about all the time, is like carving marble is a pretty extensive and like time consuming thing. Like thinking about how much time Michelangelo spent carving David's dick. Like just thinking about that, just like there had to have been days where he's like, I got to get this right.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
and spent, like, I just think about that. It's like, it's just a funny thing to think about.
And when he's on his model and he's kind of like, you know, holding the parts of the person who's modeling for him to like really get all angles and get the right size and shape and texture. Great. So
that took a detour. See, but we're allowed to say that because we have the freedom of speech, and I love that.
Exactly. All right. I'm going to request a 2-minute sabbatical. That's all I need. Because I've been talking fervently about this thing. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, my dear listeners, is you have to listen to ads now. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're back. Let's go ahead and wrap up this wonderful, super fun discussion by talking about some taking of the points that are home.
Yes. I think the big thing over these last 2 episodes is that it's not quite easy to define. Like, it's worth discussing, but I think really the concern is, where's the line? Like, at what point in time, do freedoms get infringed upon? At what point in time do we start scaling back those freedoms? At what point in time are those whatever those policies or procedures that are in place, are they too much and that they are oppressive in nature? And I don't know that we have an easy answer. I think that we have an idea of kind of what would constitute a general freedom in different areas, but I don't know that we have a good answer for where that specific line is.
That's fair. And one that I think is a take-home point, but is also something I meant to say in more detail in the discussion, so I'm just going to elaborate it really quick here, is the idea of the sort of unrestricted freedom. Because what that would mean, let's set aside the fact that you can't, by nature of the, I can't travel back in time because that's not how physics works. So there's like things that can't physically happen. But like, let's say I had unrestricted freedom. I could do whatever I want. So basically that would mean like I could take someone's car, I could take their house, I could take their money, I could kill anybody, I could help anybody, I could go anywhere I wanted to, I could do anything unrestricted. Nobody could stop me. No waiting in lines, no paying for things, no whatever. I get to do whatever I want. Now, this is not something I would want to do. Just making sure it's really clear. I have no desire to hurt anybody. I have no desire to steal from people. I'm not trying to cut in lines, even though I hate them. I mostly just avoid them.
Yeah.
But the point being that like that world where someone has that unrestricted freedom is just chaos. And again, I think I would argue strongly that it's not freedom. And this is actually where I think the take home point really lives, is it's not freedom when everybody else is adversely impacted by that. And that's sanctioned. We're just like cool with that. Right.
Right.
And so I think freedom means that everybody involved in that system has equality and equal access to the rights guaranteed by that system. And that's actually why I think I would argue that in the United States, there are many things our country and our government are very good at in protecting freedoms. And there are many things that they think they're good at that they're terrible at. And that's something that needs some work.
I think that's a great point. Absolutely. Now, another point that I would make is that there seems to be an almost universal value on freedom. Most people tend to value their ability to make choices and to be free from abuse and all that. But the discussion often breaks down when describing how personal freedoms are impacted or who should have them. And so freedom of speech is a good example of that when they talk about how to protest, where to protest. Like, they can protest, but not that way. And I think that's an example of like, people value the ability to protest, but they have like specific ideas of what that should look like. And they'll impose those ideas on somebody else, especially on marginalized groups.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as it turns to advocating harm or destruction or targeting specific people, that's when I think it's no longer freedom to protest.
Right.
As soon as people start dying or getting injured in any way, you've crossed a line.
Yep.
Assuming that the protesters are the one doing the violence. Sometimes it's happening to them. So then that's not their problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, the discussion around freedom did take an interesting turn after, in this country, 9/11, 2001, which many people relinquished freedoms, particularly around things like air travel at this point. That has not gone away. That has largely stuck with us, and it sort of is what it is. I also understand why it happened. I'm not that I necessarily agree with it, but it is the thing that I can wrap my head around at least.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where that is, I guess.
I think that's an interesting context too, because it is one of those things that people willingly relinquished freedoms.
True.
Under the guise of greater good. There's a lot to unpack within that. I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so don't stress about that. I don't want you to think that, but I did want to make sure that we did talk about that. Now, the last point that I would make is that in therapeutic settings, freedom of choice and freedom from harm seem to be the most important freedoms discussed. Yeah. Choice of interventions, choice of practitioners, choice of people to support you, and then being free of harm from those spaces, I think is really necessary to maintain at least.
Yeah, I think that's great, and probably a reasonable place to end. And I do think I just want to always bring back around the point of that, like, freedom does not mean freedom to cause harm. And also, people who get angry at you for doing things does not mean that your freedom has been impinged. And when you have specifically advocated for the rights of organizations to have the freedom to restrict their employment and their services to people based on the policies of that company, then when they exercise those freedoms, then you're being censored or restricted by that company is not an issue of freedom, because you are not being jailed, you are not being fined, you are not having anything happen to you as an outcome of the government. So no legs to stand on there. I'll leave us with that wonderful quote that I liked so much that maybe we'll elaborate on, or maybe we don't need to. Maybe it speaks for itself really well. But here's the Skinner quote that I started the last episode with. Feeling free is an important hallmark of a kind of control distinguished by the fact that it does not breed counter-control. I'm going to say it one more time because I like it so much. Feeling free is an important hallmark of a kind of control distinguished by the fact that it does not breed counter-control. And what I like about that, what I think he's saying there, is that in a system where we have freedom, we are still under the influence and following the parameters of that system.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that it looks like freedom is because we're not fighting it.
Mm-hmm.
When we're fighting it, that's when it does not look like freedom, or we wouldn't call it that. So our experience, perception of it, and what we call it is related to whether or not we are fighting against it or we're okay with the system as it is.
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay, well, that was so much. And I'm sure that there's plenty of people who would even take this a lot further. Astute listeners will notice we did not talk about at all the issue of abortion, which is a very hot topic in the United States right now. We actually are planning a full discussion on this down the road.
Yes.
So we will be coming back around to this. Again, trying to bring some science to this. Hopefully you feel like we did a good job bringing science to this one. I really tried to be as balanced and comprehensive as I could possibly be, and also just being really clear on sort of what the discussion entails, because I think there is some interesting things to unpack in the philosophy of what we mean when we talk about freedom, which is something that seems like such a basic right and gets so much airtime and discussion, but it's used as a rhetorical talking point and not as a legitimate starting point for discussion. So that's why I felt like it was
100%.
Yeah, we just needed to have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that being said, we should probably talk about recommendations.
Totally.
Recommendations.
I am recommending a music video by a band I have recommended in the past for their music videos. The band is Dance Gavin Dance. The song is called Synergy. It has a music video. And even though this is a collab song, I love it to pieces and I think it's wonderful and it's great. And that should tell you something about how I generally feel about collab songs. But I absolutely am. I've watched this video like a dozen times. I've probably listened to the song 50 times. Strong recommend there. Super fun.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. It is a really fun dive into that world. I would second that recommendation.
Cool.
My recommendation this week is a movie that I finally got to see, and it's Doctor Strange 2, Multiverse of Madness.
Yeah.
Wild movie.
Yeah.
It is one of those things where it is like full on straight up Sam Raimi through and through, which I really, really loved. So
much. It could have been a lot more aggressive and stuck true to like Sam Raimi, but it was, it had the Sam Raimi in it thoroughly.
Yeah. Thoroughly. So many shots. I was like, oh yeah, that's from Evil Dead. You know, it's good.
Right. More emphasis on the madness than the multiverse, but the multiverse was an important part too.
Yeah. So it was great. I loved it.
Really fun. Great recommendation.
Yeah,
agreed.
For sure.
Sorry. I didn't mean to take it over like it was mine.
No, you're good. It's good. It was yours before. So we share it.
Oh, that's true. Okay. Shared recommendation. Wonderful. I think that's all that I have to say right now about freedom. I think there's probably more. And like there were things that as we were preparing for this, I was thinking that I want to hit that. And I don't remember if I did talk about it now, but I think that's what we have to say about this.
I think that about covers it for the time being.
All right. If we missed something talking about freedom, if you'd like to correct us on a position that we took or an argument that we made or a slur that we stumbled through in our lack of elocution, which we could be better about sometimes, then you should reach out to us and let us know. Tell us about your favorite freedom or your least favorite freedom or how much freedom you do or don't have or want or don't want or whatever. Or you can tell us about a music video or a new action movie made by Marvel, because that's what you're going to be telling us about that you enjoyed. And that's great too. Now, if you liked our discussion about freedom and you'd like to support more discussions like this and others, or just generally let us know that you think we're the bomb diggity, you may support us over on Patreon. And there are several tiers there. You get some bonuses. You can also purchase some merch. Just go to our website. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. We're going to try and feature some things, get some stuff out there. But we got shirts and sweaters and jackets and beanies and mugs and water bottles and stickers and all kinds of fun stuff. So
many good things.
Go check that out there. You can also leave us a rating and a review. If you don't want to, if you don't have the means to or don't want to support us financially, you can always do that, and always reach out and tell a friend or just spread the word. That's part of the main way that we get around, because we do not market at all.
Nope. Nope, we do not.
With any reasonable amount of attack anyway. And I think that is about it. I do have some acknowledgements that I need to be handing out. Did I miss anything in terms of letting people know how they can promote and support us?
No, I think that covers that.
Okay, perfect. So thank you to the people that are currently on Patreon who help make this possible, and without whom I would just be a sad boy. We are talking about Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Costia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
So awesome.
Now, I also have this wonderful team of people around me for whom I am eternally grateful. They are the best. And that includes Selena, Kyle, Justin, and Alan. And of course, Shane, who will put the notes together for this one and for recording with me today.
It was so fun.
And then without our listeners, there'd be no point in doing a podcast. I mean, I might still, because I love the sound of my voice, apparently. Or at least what I'm gathering from 260, 4, 5, 6 episodes
like
that this is going to be.
So many.
Yeah, so many. Apparently, that's a thing. Otherwise, still, I thank you so much for listening and taking the time to be with us today.
Seriously.
All right. Well, that's going to close us out for our discussion on freedom. Feel free to reach out to us. We love hearing from people. You can always reach us on social media. Email us directly at info@wwd podcast. But that's all I've got. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.